the friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show that talks about literature, culture, and history in Canada. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, an artist who explores the spatial politics of history, language, community, food, and cultural translation in relationship to place. And his artwork takes the form of gallery exhibitions, 360-degree video walking tours, curated dinners, and public art. Currently, our guest teaches at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, and we are very happy to have on the show Mr. Henry Tsang. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I forgot to warn you. My last name is pronounced Tsang.
Tsang. I'm sorry. I should have asked prior to recording.
Yeah, it's not an issue for Eastern Europeans. They pronounce it correctly for some phonetic reason, but yeah, English speakers don't usually get it right.
I should have assumed that I would probably mess it up. That's
it's not surprising. It's the old Wade Giles romanization system from the 19th century.
Okay. Well, good to know. So you're here to talk about your new book that you've edited, White Riot, in this case, which is based off of an exhibit, in this case, that you did. So can you tell us a little bit more about this book? And perhaps if you want to read a section of it to introduce it, that would be awesome.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. The book is based on 360 Riot Walk, which is an interactive 360 video walking tour of the 1907 anti-Asian riots in Vancouver, and it's available on the website 360riotwalk.ca. I launched it back in 2019, and we've had guided public tours every summer. Vancouver rains a lot, so having tablets and headphones out, well, we have had some tablets destroyed by flash rains. Even though it's in the fall and it shouldn't be raining, but you know that happens. So anyone can access it through the website, and you can do a self-guided tour, or you can just look it up and just go through the tour on any browser, on any computer or mobile device. Obviously, if you're down in Vancouver in that area, you need access to the internet. So that's something that's kind of a basic requirement. And out of this book, out of this interactive project, this book grew from it, and I commissioned 6 writers as well as a historian to write a foreword, providing contextualization of 1907, the kind of conditions that people lived in back then, and conditions that led up to 1907, and then the aftermath, and it's a really significant event, and you know, setting up some of the situations that we're dealing with today. So it's a really broad range of writings. It's also very different styles, from very straightforward, accessible writing to more specified kind of academic approach. So it's not like there's a diversity within the writing styles as well as the topics and perspectives. So and one more thing I want to say about 360 Riot Walk. You got to make sure, for anyone who's going to actually try the mobile device experience, you got to make sure you tap the little green button on the bottom, because that activates the gyroscope on your mobile device, and then the image, the 360 photograph moves with your body, so it responds to your movement. So it's got to put in that little advisor there. It's in the instructions, but it's, there's a certain number of taps you got to go through. You got to activate start the language, the audio track to play, and it's available in 4 languages that were spoken in the area at that time: Cantonese, Punjabi, Japanese, and English. And in the first section, there's a Squamish, Squamish, Snitcham, local indigenous language, um, um, talking about the relationship to the land that the first peoples have had in that area since time immemorial. So, yeah, is that enough of a preface to the book?
That's much appreciated detail in this case. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And
And
go
there's
ahead.
112
Did you
images in the book, so it's also a picture book.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, and it does give a good complement in this case. I feel at least the book that I read, I know it's not published yet, but the advanced reading copy that I had, like, it does give a good complement to the visual aspect, of course, of the 360 tour, which I think was a very good choice in this case, editorially speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, the entire
Um,
script is in there in English. So,
yeah.
yeah, you could sort of be your own narrator.
There you go. It's a choose your own adventure, if you will. No, I'm
Hmm.
joking, but and I'm curious in this case because this is a topic that, as someone who lives in Montreal currently, so on the other side completely of the country, um, this is not a topic that I've heard much about, right? The 1907 anti-Asian riots, and it's not one that is much in the history books here, at least. And I'm curious if that's the case in Vancouver, and with that in mind, how you came to be interested in this particular topic, both for your exhibit and for the book.
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't get to learn about it when I was growing up here on the West Coast. I only found out about it later after I had finished university. Can't remember exactly the moment when I first heard about it, but it has been something that I've been wondering about, thinking about for quite a while.
Mm.
And I've always thought that it was, more than just a shame that we didn't learn about the largest race riot in Canada. Uh, Probably because the people who decide on curriculum in Canada probably didn't think it was useful for their master narrative. Um, and it's still not required. It is a topic where social studies teachers in K to 12 a curriculum, they can choose it if they want to, but not everyone's comfortable with topics that deal with racism. Not many people are equipped to discuss that. I think there's more education awareness now, much more, especially in the last few years. Um, Partly because of Black Lives Matter that's come up through the states. Uh, but yeah, as we become a bit more socially aware of cultural differences and conflict and being able to talk about conflict in ways that we don't kind of like personalize, right? And say, oh, that's not about me. You can't say that about me. Well, I'm not saying that about you. We're talking about conditions, right? What's your relationship to this event is kind of like a question that I had to deal with because I wasn't born in Canada and I don't have family who went through this experience, as being an attacker or an attackee. Is attackee an actual word? Uh,
It is
and
now.
and so like there's these topics that I've been wondering about subject position and how I
Mm.
can talk about it, but and I don't want to look at it as like certain objective distance as some kind of academic study where you have some kind of like intellectual freedom to just look at whatever you want to look at. There's a lot of criticisms about those approaches, anyways. Um, for better or worse. I think they're useful. They need to be addressed. But I do have this question that that has been in my mind since formative years growing up here in Canada. Since I was three, we came from Hong Kong in '68. Um, that what is this place I ended up in, and like how did I get the get to call it home? We were fleeing the '67 riots in Hong Kong, the leftist riots. For some of you who know about that, it was a crazy time, literally crazy time, and bombs going off everywhere. So at '67 was when Canada changed the Immigration Act or enacted the changes from the year before or 2 years before, can't remember exactly, to a point system. So it wasn't just prioritizing Western Europeans, and so we got to come as a result of that shift. And so I've often wondered what would have life had been like being Chinese if we had been here earlier. Not that we could have come during the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? For what, 24 years, I think,
And
four
31, right? So
23 to
almost,
47.
oh,
I think
23.
23 to
Yeah, yeah,
47.
yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. So all Chinese were banned from coming into the country except for scholars and diplomats. And so over those 24 years, I think four people came as
Sounds about
those
right.
exceptions. Yeah. But anyways, so what is my relationship to this place? And in a way, what's my responsibility to understand the place of the now, the present, because it didn't get to be this way for nothing. Like there are
Mhm.
reasons why things are the way they are here, and these reasons will also dictate how things could possibly be in the future, right? And we have a say in that. We don't really have a say in
For
what
sure.
already has happened. So, yeah, as someone who understands the importance of history, I'm sure uh, this is all kind of like obvious, but um, yeah, it's just something I've been wondering about for a lot because I remember the shift in my body as a 3 year old coming from Hong
Mhm.
Kong, from just taking for granted my normalness in Hong Kong, and then
Right.
coming here and feeling alien.
Yeah.
And that corporeal shift was jarring. There's also the linguistic shift, not being able to understand what people are saying around me. Now, being part of the dominant culture in Hong Kong is complicated because yeah, you're part of the majority as an ethnicity or a culture, but you weren't part of the ruling kind of, well, not class, the ruling race, I suppose, because it
Right.
was
Right.
it was old British white men running everything, right?
Yep.
So and then people still had to like defer to the British and the white British, and yeah, they had a lot of privileges. They could just literally walk to the front of a lineup and just automatically expect to get into wherever they wanted to get. So, which was different than Shanghai when during the foreign occupation and so forth. My mom is from Shanghai, and she would talk about how you'd have to kowtow to a European foreigner or Japanese. Otherwise, if a cop was nearby, they would beat the hell out of you.
Incredible. Yeah. I never
Yeah, and
heard
that's
that.
not that long ago, really, right?
No. No, no, no. Less than 100 years ago. Yeah. It's like,
Yeah, way less. I mean, she's not that old.
no,
And so,
obviously. But like in the grand scheme of history, I mean, yeah.
yeah, so, these are realities that for us are so foreign growing up here.
Sure.
Um, and thank goodness, right? So, yeah, we have a lot of privileges that other people haven't had, and our experiences need to be kind of like compared, just so we understand what our privileges are, and also understand what kind of other inequities that we need to identify and address. Kind of getting
Mhm.
ahead of myself here, um,
No, but
waxing
I think
on.
that's interesting to consider. And the it kind of leads in actually to my next question in a sense, when I'm wondering, what kind of assumptions you had about the topic before going into it, right? And you kind of allude to this insofar as your perspective was different as someone who grew up most of your life here but wasn't from Canada per se, right? Even though you spent the majority of your life here. And so I'm curious, like, that, like what kind of assumptions you would have brought into it, into this project, and
Yeah,
how these perhaps would have shifted.
yeah. Maybe I could tie in your question with your previous one a little bit because I need
Course.
to backtrack a little bit to talk about what I learned in the research. Uh,
Mm.
so this project, the book, comes out of the 360 Riot Walk, 360 video walking tour, which comes out of another project called Riot Food Here, which comes out of another project called the Unwelcome Dinner, which was a curated meal um, commemorating the 125th anniversary of Vancouver's first anti-Chinese riot, or first race riot, which happened only a few months after incorporation of the city in 1887 in February. So what happened was a Chinese crew was brought together to clear the land by Cole Harbor downtown Vancouver now, and a bunch of white laborers got all worked up over jobs that they didn't get because they were paying the Chinese like half the amount, and a bunch of them, a couple of hundred, 300, stormed down to that area. Some laborers actually came from Victoria to attack the Chinese. So they beat them up. They burned their tents and bed clothings and all stuff. There was a Chinatown at the time, so a lot of the Chinese fled towards Chinatown. The white rioters, a mob, they chased them there, and I think they did some damage in the Chinatown and so forth. I think there were 3 cops in Vancouver at the time, and they weren't able to be effective. So that was the first race riot, and so the dinner included speakers talk about that then and now and so forth, and out of that grew the Riot Food Here, which was a public art pop-up food offering event on 4 of the locations where the Asiatic Exclusion League organized the parade and demonstration, anti-Asian demonstration, 1907, and then along the way, Chinatown and Powell Street, where the mob attacked the Chinese and the Japanese. So there was 5 different foods being offered to anybody walking down the street. People sit down, and we'd have discussions around what they knew about Vancouver history, and the project basically asked the question, what would you have eaten before going to the demonstration and joining the mob to attack the Chinese and then the Japanese? What would you have eaten just before the angry white men came to attack you in your community? Or what would you have eaten just before the angry white guys attacked the Asians on your land? So there was Yorkshire pudding with roast beef and what's the spicy thing? Horseradish. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
For
Okay.
the British reference or European reference. There was congee with pork and corn being a very North American kind of dish. There's mochi with a red bean paste for the Japanese. There was candied salmon with spruce tips for indigenous, and there was dal and chapati for the Punjabi reference. And I worked with a chef, Chris Barnholden, and in doing the research, I did some call outs to local community members, and no one's alive from back then, but some people spoke about their grandfather or father and what happened with them, and family stories, and also I had to do a lot of research to find out what people were eating back in 1907. And people ate much more simply back then, right? It's not like, oh, tonight I think I'll have Thai food, and then tomorrow I'll have some Indian food, and then I'll have some ramen. It wasn't like that back then. There was some crossover, like there's Japanese chop suey in the Japanese area. I wonder what that tasted like, and then chop suey, and that's not really Chinese either. So like, double not Chinese. So it's kind of interesting. But there isn't a lot of this history documented that's non-white. We have menus, we have in the archives and so forth. But yeah, a lot of the stuff it's purely you got to talk to people and understand what was available. But because we're a port city, we did get a lot of goods from Asia, so people did get to eat their comfort foods as much as they could. But anyways, so that influenced 360 Riot Walk. But 360 Riot Walk came about because Michael Barnholden, who is the co-writer for the script and is the author of Reading the Riot Act, which is about the history of riots in Vancouver, he was giving another, well, for Riot Food Here, I asked him to do a walking tour of the 1907 riots, which he's done over time intermittently. And I've been on them before. And while he was doing it, I was thinking, oh, wouldn't this be great if we didn't actually, we could have this tour whenever, on demand. And oh, what if it was this 360 experience where, you have the whole kind of like space around you and you can access it any time. And I went, oh, I finally came up with the 360 video idea because I've been wanting to work with that technology, but I've never had a reason to. So that's how this came to be as an art project. And when the art project happened, I thought, okay, well, great. How long is this going to last on the internet before Apple changes their operating system again and screws up the way that I can, have to kind of reconfigure things and, technology and HTML5, how long is that going to last for in the future for, web delivery and you can't really have much of a legacy for anything that's on the internet, right? So and also, and I love books. I've always loved books, and it's a way to further contextualize some of the ideas and conversations and explorations that 360 Riot Walk is putting forth as a question, I guess, of what is our relationship to a time and place. So yeah, that's how this book came to be. Sorry, your audio's off, or it's off for me. Oh, there we
Can
go.
you hear me? No, okay. I don't know why that happened. Anyway, so but I'm curious because I didn't realize that it was necessarily influenced by the food, exhibitions that you did or exhibits. And I'm reminded of a book I recently read. Have you read Fred Waugh's Diamond Grill?
Oh yeah,
And
yeah. Sure. I've
yeah,
collaborated with Fred before. Yeah.
right. So that's I just recently read it for a class that I'm TAing for, and I have that in the back of my mind, and it's something that I really appreciate that you bring up in this case as for our listeners as a kind of reminder of just how much food is a representation of history in a sense, or how much we can learn from history through the foods that people ate, either what they had access to or what they chose to make, right? Or how they chose to adapt their different foods to, a new way of life, right? And I just wanted to say that that was a really interesting, how could I say, genealogy of your project in a sense. I wasn't expecting it to come from food, but it makes a whole lot of sense now that you actually explain it.
Yeah, I love Diamond Grill. It's
Yeah,
one of my all-time favorite books.
it's awesome.
Yeah.
Pushing that a little bit further, and obviously, with the existence of art history departments, there is obviously a relation between art and history, but I'm curious, how you see the interaction between art as it exists in the 360 Riot Walk and history. How is that reflected in your book, and what is that engagement like for you?
Well, you can make art out of anything, right? Or about anything. I mean, you can also make art about nothing. That's a much higher bar.
Sure. Yeah.
And when it's effective, oh boy, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
something that is well, anything beyond representation is a pretty challenging strategy and admirable but anyways, back to the specificities around history. All we can never do when we're working in conversation with history is to really just raise questions, because history is always being, well, okay, ideally, history is always being reevaluated, right? I mean, if it isn't, then there's something wrong with that society.
Right.
Because if it's fixed, that means society at that moment in time, the current, the contemporary, is not engaged in developing or progressing. or evolving or whatever term might be considered, if it's a nostalgic kind of approach to history, then it's this convenient device to control people and how they value the way things are, and that they need to be content and not ask questions.
Mm.
So the and it's all for me. It all comes down to power dynamics, and who those who get to question history um, are representative of this need and desire to grow and develop. And we can never know enough, right? I mean, anyone who the more you learn, the more you understand just how little you know. And the more you know, the better you're able to ask more effective questions.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah.
So it just gives you a bit more insight to be able to go, okay, I've now learned this, and what I've learned in the process is all the other stuff that like I can't find answers to. And if you share those questions, then other people go, that's a really good question, or I've been working on this too. And it takes many people to open up these experiences that have always existed but haven't been officially recognized. So, can art play a role in this development of questioning? Yeah, sure, of course. But there's a lot of different ways to approach art making. But that's one of my main motivations.
Mm.
But yeah,
Interesting.
it's first and
And
foremost art. It has to be art. There's the formal considerations, the aesthetic considerations. But I appreciate art for art's sake. I love art for art's sake. But for me, art is connected with raising questions.
right. And actually, going off of that idea, I'm curious, like, can you elaborate on your artistic choices? You mentioned earlier that you were always interested in working with like the virtual aspects that you did work with the 360 Riot Walk. I'm wondering, what the logic was behind that particular use of that technology, and why you feel like it was useful to approach this particular riot.
Well, so the use of 360 technology, it's a different way of um, perceiving the kind of like, well, in this case, the built environment, because I'm asking people to physically stand in the same spot where a rioter stood before they, threw a rock at somebody or something. Um, and 360 video is dramatically different than just the non 360 video, where editing is really important, right? Montage, etc. Um, if you zoom into something as an editor or as the camera person, um, that's what the viewer sees. And then, you have pans and tilts. Pans when the camera goes sideways, tilt is when it goes up and down. Um, or, a dolly shots when the camera like slides around, moves around, that kind of stuff. Well, for 360 video, you can do that, but I didn't bother doing that. It's all fixed, right? So you're the viewer, the participant, when they move, they get to choose what they're looking at, and they get to choose what you zoom in on and so forth. The role of audio becomes that much more important, because audio then can direct the participant to, okay, to your left is, and if you zoom in on to your right and so forth. So it was really interesting learning or thinking about and trying to figure out how to employ 360 video in a very different way than the videos that I've made before, and also issues around safety had to be addressed, because this is going to be outside, it's in an urban space, it's busy, there's some narrow sidewalks, there's cars and buses that go by. I didn't want anybody to kind of get killed while they were doing this tour, or, block other people on the sidewalk and so forth. And so because there's an audio track, that it's really challenging to experience this in real life, in situ, on location, because you have all the stimulation and you got to keep your body safe, but you're trying to focus on the screen and also what's happening on the screen. And at some point, you can just stop looking at it and just listen to the audio. But there's a lot of information in the audio. We tried really hard to make the language clear and accessible, but there's an awful lot of information in a very short amount of time at each location. So they were all kind of like challenges to deal with. I don't know if I really answered your question
Feel like you
specifically.
did. Yeah,
Yeah.
like in a wider way, yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. And if I could, I guess I could ask another question in this case about the artistic process that went into it. And a major part of your work is the question, I feel, at least reading it, is the question of adaptation, right? You're adapting textually something that you did artistically, which was in response to a historical event in a way, right? And I'm curious how you feel like you've engaged, like, how can I formulate this question? I feel like I'd be interested to hear your ideas about the idea of adaptation when you're talking about art and history in this particular moment, and if you feel like you've engaged with that beyond this project.
Gee. Um, well,
Going
each
at it with the large questions here.
Well, yeah, no, it's a great question. Um, each medium has its own, well, there are advantages to each medium. Each medium can do things other mediums can't, right? Like, for instance, um, music's different than spoken word, which is different than dance, which is different than 360 video, which is different from traditional video, right? So they all can do something that other mediums can't do. So within 360 Riot Walk, there are these different experiences depending on which mode of delivery you decide to participate in. So the most ideal experience is the embodied one on the site, um, whether it's self-guided or the guided tours. The guided tours are actually, I think, the most ideal, but we only offer so many every summer. This year coming up, there's going to be four, two at the Powell Street Festival in early August, and then I think a couple in July, maybe one in the anniversary of the riots, which is in early September. Most years we've had six. We only did two during 2020 with COVID. All like with taking precautions and so forth. So that would be the ideal experience because there's an introduction before the tour starts. People are shown how to use the tablets and what buttons to push and so forth on the screen, and how to start the audio. And then there's a post-tour discussion, and that's where it crystallizes the experience and sharing what people thought and observed and thought about, and comparing notes and so forth. That is such a special kind of moment. The tours are really small. They only accommodate 10 people, and they sell out really quickly. They've been free every year, but this year we're trying to get some cost recovery out of two of them, and then the other two during Powell Street Festival will be free, as it has been in the past. Powell Street Festival, for people who don't know, is a Japanese-Canadian arts and cultural festival at Oppenheimer Park in Vancouver. Oppenheimer Park is the very last stop of 360 Riot Walk, and Powell Street Festival has taken on the stewardship of the public tours, and we're developing virtual tours as well. So because there's been a lot of interest and demand for a virtual version, especially not during the summer, and you can accommodate way more than 10 people for a virtual tour. So back to this question of adaptation. For a book, there's ways in which these commission writings can be placed in conversation with each other and the script. So first and foremost, the book is got the script as its kind of like foundation, and then all these stills from the 360 tour from the 13 stops. A lot of these video grabs in a way. They're actually screenshots, and then different archival images that have been superimposed within the contemporary landscape. There's details in there in the book, and then these 7 different writings are what gives the whole project context. And that was, so that was my attempt at adapting something that's 360 video into book format. So it's been exciting and challenging, and it's its own thing. But in some ways, I'm still kind of like wondering about, like, I often think about this trajectory from these different projects kind of like building on other ones, and I don't usually work this way, but maybe it's a new kind of like chapter I'm turning later in life.
It's the first time for everything, exactly. And getting into a bit more of the content of the tour and the book, I'm curious, right? Because the White Riot as a book and as a tour, I feel, is very much about the legacy of the riots, right? And not just about the events. And you've mentioned this as well. And I'm curious, right, what you would say was the immediate legacy and perhaps the long-standing legacy of the anti-Asian riots that happened in 1907.
Yeah, well, 1907 was the riots was really a flashpoint of a lot of different conditions that had been leading up to it. So with nation building, Canada, the incorporation of the city of Vancouver, British Columbia joining the Confederacy and all that kind of stuff. Prior to those acts, in the kind of like colonization of British Columbia, the mainland, and Vancouver Island, they were separate colonies, right? The people who are coming into this area from outside, there wasn't this kind of like, there wasn't the same kind of legislated discrimination. So when James Douglas, the governor, invited black folks to come up from California because they were really afraid of Americans taking over British Columbia, at some point it was 10% of the non-Indigenous population, of black folks. And when the Chinese came for the gold rush, they were discriminated against, but if they stayed, they could actually vote, right? And same with the Japanese until they were disenfranchised as well. For the Chinese, there was a head tax, and which grew and grew and grew. And Native folks, they were also allowed to vote until they weren't. So all these rights were being stripped away from targeted peoples, right? Who were designated as being undesirable or threatening or something like that, because there's basically the rise of white nationalism, and that wasn't uncommon, and it's still not uncommon around the world, right? I mean, you look at all the ethnic purges that are still happening. You look at all the discriminatory legislations in all these places around the world where you're not allowed to be a Japanese citizen or and so forth, right? So it's not like something that has gone away, but is this something that we want to support? Is this something that we want to romanticize and say, oh, good old days, right? Make Canada great again. Like, yeah, but you know what? You might not have had other rights as well. Be careful.
It's very specific.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So would you actually be part of the ruling class? Because if you aren't, like, good luck, right? Yep. So equality and all that kind of stuff. It's a good thing, I think, but not everyone thinks that way. So back to your question, I guess. So the 1907 riots happened around a lot of hysteria with these ships coming in with a lot of Japanese laborers. There was one particular one, the SS Kumeric, was coming in from Hawaii, I think, and it had a bunch of Japanese and Punjabi workers. They were fleeing Hawaii because of the bubonic plague that had broken out there. Yeah, there was the plague has not didn't just go away a long time ago.
No. I mean, isn't it theoretically still around? We just
Yeah,
like have it under wraps pretty much, but it doesn't it still exist? Yeah, but I didn't realize that that's why they had fled Hawaii, but that's really interesting. Ooh.
yeah,
Anyway, sorry,
yeah.
go on.
Yeah, and then there were going to be a lot of like poor Japanese laborers coming into work on the
Hmm.
railroads up north. Like something, they wanted something like 10 or 15,000 of them. Like it was a huge workforce. So yeah, all these white laborers got really worked up, and it didn't help that 1907, early on in the year, there was a stock market crash in New York. So that affected some of the economy here as well. And Vancouver has always had a history of boom and bust. So when it's booming, yeah, everyone's just trying to make money as much as they can. And then when it busts, well, what do you do with time on your hands and who can you blame, right? So
Yeah.
it was a blaming time. And the Asiatic Exclusion League, the local chapter, the folks who started that up, they wanted a piece of the action because the AEL had been setting up all across the West Coast, and it was Vancouver just wanted to be part of that movement. So, or some of the folks in Vancouver. So the riot happened. The parade and demonstration happened. The riot wasn't planned, but it wasn't surprising. A lot of people were very nervous prior to the parade and demonstration.
Mhm.
Some people actually left Vancouver to go to the outskirts because they were afraid they'd get attacked in Chinatown or Powell Street, and that did happen. So, and then what happened afterwards was beyond the strike that the Chinese enacted for 3 days that basically shut the city down, and the demand for reparations and so forth. Uh, the 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 effect of the strike was that the people who organized it, they were banned from having further demonstrations, the EL, but they achieved some of their goals. They didn't get the outright banning of Japanese because that couldn't happen because of the dynamics between Japan and England.
Mhm.
Canada being an English, effectively colony
Sure.
still, um, and Japan being a rising nation, economic and military power, especially 2 years after beating the Russians in a war. So they had to kind of like, allow Japanese come in. But there was that Hayashi Lemieux gentleman's handshake agreement that reduced the number of Japanese coming in, but it was only for men. So women could come in,
Yeah.
but
It's
it was 400. It became 400 the year after, which is dramatic curtailing. The Chinese head tax was still at $500, but then in a matter of like 15 years, it became effectively zero. But they also identified South Asians as a target to try to keep them out, and so was it the year after or so the Continuous Journey Act was passed to keep Indians from coming into
that would make
Canada
sense. Yeah.
by
Yeah.
saying any ship that lands can't have stopped anywhere along the way, and that
Yeah,
Komagata
that makes
Maru.
sense. It would like 1910, I want to say 1911, but
Yeah,
I'm trying to think of it off the top of my head. But yeah,
it's in
that
the
sounds about
script. You can refer to the script.
right.
Yeah, I could refer to the script. And then the Komagata Maru incident in 1914, testing the limits of that legislation, which they changed when the ship was in the harbor, right? Just to make sure. And the ship was never allowed to dock, and the people, running out of water, food, and so forth. It was there in our harbor for like what, a month or 2 months, a long, long
Something
time.
like that. Yeah, way too
Yeah,
long.
yeah. And then sent back, and then when they got back, the Indian military opened fire on them, all the people. Yeah, quite the story. So yeah, all that stuff did happen, uh, if not in part, well, if not directly, but certainly in part due to the 1907 riots.
Right. I find it very interesting that you that part of your own chapter in the book and you mentioning it here, the idea that some people just felt that something was off, right, and left. And I find that interesting to think about this aura I guess that happens, right? And this, despite it not being necessarily systematized at that time or as much, there is necessarily a feeling that you get from people that you might, be in contact with, that you're not necessarily welcome. I'm using a royal you in this case, but I find it very interesting that that would have happened in that moment. And I remember thinking about that long and hard while I read that passage. I was like, oh, that, I wonder like how much that's happened throughout history of that same type of feeling. But yeah, I just thought it was a good point to bring up in this case. Um,
Well, I think it's still very common, depending
oh,
on,
yeah.
what kind of body one has. The vulnerability, um, and the potential for some nasty person to inflict violence on you because they don't like, presuming that you're, like, say, Muslim, or presuming that you're not heterosexual, or presuming that you're, whatever, there's a list. I mean, and the vulnerability still exists to this day, right? So, we what kind of responsibility do we have as a society to to uh, to make that seriously not okay and actually have some ramifications for, um, not just the violence but the attitudes, because these are attitudinal shifts to be more, what's the definition? How would one define being human? Like, to be
Yeah, I guess to
an
be more
asshole, is
socially
that part of it?
inclusive.
Yeah, it can be, but isn't that something we need to fight against?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. That's, we didn't get to where we are, I guess, by being assholes. Insofar as like the human project, I feel depends on, mutual aid and trust on some level, right? And anything that goes against that, and maybe optimistic on my end, but anything that goes against that goes against the very idea of what it means to be human. And I guess you're right that on some level there is an assholeness to it, but at the same time, like the pushing down of that assholeness, I think, is an integral part of, the human project. But maybe that's just me who's optimistic.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, me
and
too. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't make work, right?
yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned in this case, right, that there are certain ramifications to these, or that there should be ramifications to these types of hate crimes or violence towards another. And I'm curious, how did Asian communities who were targeted in this case respond or react after these riots?
Well, I love your question because it brings up this kind of like misconception of how the Chinese didn't fight back, that they were passive, but the Japanese did. Now, that misconception is consistent with the relative power difference between the Japanese and Canadian communities at the time. As I mentioned before, Japan as a nation was this rising economic, political, and military power. So the Japanese Canadians living, in British Columbia, they had that kind of like backing, right? And there was a consulate in Vancouver, a Japanese consulate in Vancouver, so they had representation. And China was basically a nation that was falling apart. The corruption, for the past century or so, it just like made it, like it was right. And 4 years later, there was a revolution,
Mhm.
and the dynasty, that dynasty fell apart, and then it got picked apart by, the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese. You also had the opium issue, right, which the British introduced as a way to reverse the flow of gold and silver, because of tea and silk, the trade
Mhm.
the trade imbalance. So that talk about foreign policy, genius ideas, right?
Yeah, just get a
Uh,
whole population addicted to drugs.
yeah,
God damn. Yeah,
yeah. And we're going to grow it in India. We got this idea from the Middle East, and we're going to ship it over from Bombay on
that's empire
clippers.
for you.
Oh, it's just like, wow, who came up with that idea? And boy, it worked. So, yeah, the Chinese didn't have that kind of, political clout, but they fought back when they could. They didn't prepare for a riot, but a lot people were nervous and they did lock their doors and they stayed in because they were afraid something bad was going to happen. And when it happened, I guess it's kind of like when you get attacked out of nowhere, although this is not out of nowhere, but still, you're kind of in shock, right? I mean, unless you're attacked all the time. But most people are just kind of like, if they're vulnerable and wary and all that stuff, uh, you don't exactly know how to respond right away unless you've been training for this moment your whole life. But most average people aren't like that, right? And most people aren't fighters either. So when you have angry people coming at you in a group, um, and you're just by yourself on the street, well, you run,
Yeah.
right? And that's basically what happened at the beginning. When they could, when they had access the next day, I think the gun shops opened. They went and bought every single gun that they could, and the police then said to the gun shop owners, "Stop selling to the Asians." They didn't say anything about selling to the whites, but they did say that. But they banded together, they organized, and they set out patrols and try to protect their people in the neighborhood. So that is not common knowledge because you have this kind of stereotype, I guess, because the Chinese were um, more oppressed um,
Hmm.
for a lot of different reasons, but there was also a big class difference. And you didn't have as many people who were in the merchant class, and you didn't have any people. You had probably more folks who were um, from small villages who were not literate, who weren't educated. They were laborers. You had a lot of Japanese like that too, but you also had Japanese who came from larger, like cities and with different skill sets. And the Japanese were also a lot of them dressed in Western clothing, and the Chinese were still wearing their more traditional Chinese clothing. So there, yeah, there's all these different kind of like signs
Hmm.
that set them apart. They didn't get along either, the Japanese and Chinese. There'd been, a history of various conflicts, and then later on, of course, Japanese Empire going to Manchuria and killing and torturing and all that stuff. And 10 million people died, right? That's a lot. And so forth. So, but you had individuals who would be friendly with each other, or having business relations. That's again another kind of language. So, but I was asked at one point by somebody, did people have um, friendships across different communities? And I go, generally, no,
Yeah, of
as far as I can tell. But you did have exceptions, right?
course. And it's always hard to tell because it's not necessarily something that's in the archive or something that you can always like actively turn to as a source, right? So, but yeah, I guess like you're saying, it's interesting to think about the idea of friendship as an act of resistance in a sense, or like
Hmm.
these community bondings as an act of resistance, or as a way of saying no, we're not going to be kicked out of what has become our home, right? And I feel like that answer kind of turns to that idea in a sense, and it's not one that people consider enough. Mm,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. I mean, it takes work for, to overcome some of these differences and also to overcome prejudices and biases,
Yes.
right? So you're actually taking a stand, and you have to actually be able to kind of face some of your own peers and your own community's suspicions for those friendships and alliances. Some people are just more open than others, but for others who are willing to, like who who are defiant against
Mm.
those social norms of prejudices. Yeah, that takes courage.
And I'm curious, thinking about the way you approach this book, right, from an editorial standpoint, or as someone who, I guess editorial is the right word, as someone who brought together all these different articles and perspectives, right? I'm curious how you determined your, I guess, editorial vision for this work specifically, right, and what you wanted to do with this project.
Well, I wanted various perspectives to be addressed. What some of the issues around Powell Street, where the Japanese Canadian community used to be in Vancouver prior to their internment in 1942. Um, so there's an essay by Angela May and Nicole Yakashiro uh, entitled "Why We Say Powell Street and Not Japantown," which is well, it basically explains how the word Japantown was never used by people in the Japanese Canadian community. For them, it was Pao Street or Pauru Gai. Pauru is kind of like is this the right word? Japanicization? I don't know how to say this. And for Chinese, it's sinicization, right?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess it would be Japanization.
Yeah, of the word Powell. And then
Mm,
some people might say Nihonmachi, which is actually literally translated as Japantown. But no one said Japantown unless you're from the outside. And there's been a move by the city of Vancouver to use that term and also to kind of like beautify it and to make it
mm,
tourist friendly and so forth. So it's
naturally.
their essays in resistance to that kind of outsiders imposition of a name and the power of place names. And then for a Chinatown kind of perspective, Melody Ma's essay, A Changing Chinatown on Gentrification and Resilience,
Mhm.
that looks at the history of of basically resistance against racism in Chinatown, and looks at also the some of the forces that are at play in Chinatown with displacement of working class poor people, especially seniors, with all these condos that are going up there, and a lot of these shops are empty now. But they're being replaced by like $300 sneaker shops and expensive knife shops. You know, like I mean, they got nice things in there, but the old people they're running out of places to buy their food and eat at. And there's a lot of different factors at play. It's a very complicated situation. There's been this, other areas where there's more Chinese people and so forth. But Chinatown, as a historic place, it's kind of it's being really seriously challenged. Uh, and then there's the Bellingham riot, which for a South Asian who knows their history, you mentioned the 1907 riots to them, and they immediately think of Bellingham, not Vancouver, because 3 days prior to Vancouver's riot, uh, um, the mill workers there, the Punjabi mill workers, are rounded up by the white workers and beat up and forced marched out of town or forced onto trains. A bunch of those folks who could make it to the border were only allowed into Canada because they were British subjects, and they got into Vancouver just in time to witness another riot, but this time not aimed at them. So they because they had to be in that area, they couldn't live in the other parts of town because they were white, those parts of town. So they had to go to this, non-white ethnic area to look for housing. And so Paul Engelsberg, who's a historian down in Bellingham, Washington State, which is an hour's drive south of Vancouver, uh, he he basically lays out, I think, about 6 or 7 different riots that all happened in 1907.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
yeah, so it's not like Vancouver's riot was an isolated event. It was
No,
it was really common on the West Coast.
which makes it all the more frightening in a sense, right? That it wasn't. We sometimes have this idea that because it's a one-off incident, people I think have this imagination that it could happen at any point. There's that kind of fear that feeds into itself. In a sense, I feel of the unknown that could happen whenever. But I feel that there is that fear of just the fact that it was, well, we now know so frequent, is also a type of terrifying. Yeah, I guess it's a terrifying event or affair to consider on its own terms. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, racial strife was really, really common. Yeah,
Yeah,
not good. And it's come back again, right? With
yeah.
COVID, which fanned the flames of anti-Asian racism and violence. And um, but there's more awareness of it now. Black Lives Matter has had an effect in Canada, and there's ways to track it, and people can do it now, and using the internet and so forth instead of just word of mouth, right? And word of mouth only reaching so far because usually it's contained within certain communities.
Right. And there have,
So
at least here in Montreal, there have been some similar to Black Lives Matter. There have been some movements uh, in order to stop Asian, or anti-Asian racism, I should say. And I imagine that would be the case across Canada as well. But these these movements are not restricted to specific groups either. Like, again, there has been some pushback in the modern day as well, which is worth noting and encouraging.
Yeah. And then there's three other essays. I don't know if you want to hear about them too, but
Of course.
if you want to move on, that's fine.
No, it's fine. I'm always interested to have more reading material. I clearly don't read enough.
Well, one is a kind of like call to arms by the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, and they actually, this piece actually includes some statistics around anti-Asian violence in Canada since COVID, and also saying that it is part of the history, and these folks are part of the labor movement in Canada, and they're challenging not just the people in the labor movement, but because they're connected with that, to confront and stop spreading hate, and that they have a role in it. And it's really important to understand the role that organized labor has had in fanning the flames of racism in Canada, and also to understand that there's been a lot of work that labor unions have done to address this and to become more inclusive and to be more just. So I think it's that's part of our history that we really need to understand, and also, there's so many good things that have come out of the labor movement. There's been bad things that were part of that fabric as well, right? Because it was very exclusive. Most of the labor unions were white, right, and wanted to keep it that way, with a few exceptions. And the script the White Riot script does talk about the Wobblies. That there was a longshoreman union in North Vancouver that was inclusive, that the head of their union was a black guy was it from Jamaica? Can't remember. It's in the script. And there were indigenous workers, there was Asian workers, etc., and they all worked together. Unfortunately, the Wobblies got decimated. They were viciously attacked and targeted around the world, but they did have they were radically inclusive and open. So anyways, back to these various contributors. Andy Yan, who's an urban geographer, looks at the 1901 and 1911 censuses as a way to analyze how race was socially constructed, and the kind of namings that the censuses used, and brings the question like, who is a Canadian, right? Who gets to qualify as that, and who gets identified, and how are they kind of like tabulated? And then there's a piece by the Right to Remain Collective, which is a research project by academics out of University of Victoria and Queens, looking at the history of dispossession of people in the downtown east side. And they tend to be working class folks. And two of the main researchers are Japanese Canadians. So there's that kind of emphasis because of the Japanese Canadians being dispossessed of all their possessions from 1942 onwards. Some people don't know that their belongings, their properties were sold off to fund their own internment by the government. And there's all these great interviews, snippets of interviews with people living in the downtown east side of various backgrounds, talking about their struggles, their challenges, and also their pride in being part of the community, and how strong the networks are in supporting each other. So and then the foreword is written by Patricia Roy, who's a historian, and whose book A White Man's Province has been really important for me in trying to understand what's happened here and the history of British Columbia. She's a retired professor, but she was really clear in analyzing the white supremacy attitudes of the first century.
And sorry, I don't want to. I do want to get to the last few questions here, but I unfortunately have a call at 2, and your answers have been so interesting so far and in depth, and I wish I could talk to you all day in this case. But I'm curious, right? As someone who does teach, right, at Emily Carr University, if you think that there's a particular way that people should be approaching Asian Canadian history or art, either in the classroom as a pedagogical, from a pedagogical perspective, or in the wider public, because there have been movements recently, both in the university and outside, to engage differently than what one might expect with history, right? When we're talking about Indigenous people, for example, or Black history. I'm curious if you see that as occurring with Asian Canadian history as well.
Well, Asian Canadian history is Canadian history, right? It's part of our past. And when I say our, I mean I
Thank you.
wasn't born here, but I'm Canadian, right? I mean, I'm going to presume you're Canadian too, especially with the
Yes.
title of your podcast. Yeah, so what
Yes.
does it mean to be a Canadian? And for some people they don't want to be Canadian because they want to be something else and like and if you have good reasons for that then yeah, that's part of our fabric. And I think we need to understand it's a complicated set of relations. But and that's all part of the history that we need to understand to understand who we are. So the more that we can um, um, bring forth, especially the experiences that haven't had the respect to be able to be told these stories. That's all the work that needs to be done. Who gets to tell it? Yeah, well, that's a big part of the picture, right? And how
Yeah,
it's told. So that's where a lot
absolutely.
of the work has to go into. Being okay, so being respectful is important, but being too respectful isn't being respectful anymore because you're actually
Mhm.
like pulling the punches and sometimes things get sanitized, right? Or maybe a story is being told through the lens of guilt as opposed to just matter of fact. This
Yeah,
is what happened, right?
yeah,
So how do we cut through all this other stuff to get to this is just what happened? And let's tell it in such a way that maybe some people don't feel like they're being blamed, but rather this is like something that you need, like we need to identify with what happened as something that, well, if you think it's wrong, then maybe we need to do something about it and reflect on what we're doing now that might be also considered wrong in a few years' time.
yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more in this case. I agree. As someone who does, in his own studies, try to engage with, groups that are outside of, like you were saying, my own white Canadian heritage in this case, right? It is something that both needs to be considered, but also I don't want to say pushed up against necessarily, but because that's perhaps a poor choice of words, but at least um, the limits of what can be said, or at least the way that we talk about things, should be pushed and continue to be engaged with, right? Rather than just saying that one cannot talk about one thing just because you're not there, right? I don't know. I find it very interesting to think about, but yes, I appreciate that answer very much. And I'm curious, is there a particular part of the book? I always ask people this at the end of the interviews. Is there a particular part of the book that you would like to read from in this case in order to give people a sense of what the text is like?
Yeah, I could read the last stop of the walking tour.
Of course.
I don't know how long it'll take though. Uh, I think when Michael Barnholden he does the voiceover
Mhm.
for the English um, um, uh, version. I think it's about 6 minutes, so probably 6 or 7 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. I'll try. Um, Now, where the heck is it? I think it's page 101. So I'm scrolling through the PDF. Here we go. Stop 13. Powell Street Grounds, Oppenheimer Park. To the south is Oppenheimer Park, which opened in 1898 as the Powell Street Grounds, or Paru Grando in Japanese. It was a sports field, home to the neighborhood's legendary baseball team, the Asahi. Indigenous people who felt unwelcome in Stanley Park after its founding in 1887 made this park their home. In 1936, the Powell Street Grounds was designated by the city as the only place where public gatherings and demonstrations were allowed. Over the years, many large crowds gathered here to fight unemployment, poverty, and racism. During the Great Depression, 1,000 unhoused people were encamped in the blocks surrounding the park, foreshadowing the housing crisis Vancouver is facing today. By Monday morning, September 9th, the riots had died down in part due to heavy rains. The Chinese Benevolent Association and clan associations organized a general strike that continued until Wednesday morning, shutting down many parts of Vancouver, including the sawmills and a third of the restaurants. The Japanese went to work Monday, but left in the afternoon to attend a public meeting at the Powell Street grounds to discuss their demands for reparation from the city. Mayor Bethune came to address the crowd's concerns. Ironic, given that he was one of the Asiatic Exclusion League's co-founders. The Japanese and Chinese communities petitioned the government to pay for their damages. Businesses in Chinatown were closed for up to 6 days. The Chinese Benevolent Association offered the following assistance. If you go back to your original workplaces and your employers are not willing to hire you and hire others instead, please report to the Chinese Benevolent Association and we will negotiate for you. They also announced, any Chinese people who have been beaten by Westerners, please report to the Chinese Benevolent Association and we will negotiate with them. Ottawa sent out the federal Deputy Minister of Labour, William Lyon Mackenzie King, to conduct a Royal Commission inquiry. Pressure applied to England by Japan resulted in a swift response, with over $9,000 in settlement for damages in Nihonmachi. Compensation for the Chinese was slower, as they lacked the political support of an up-and-coming nation, but eventually totaled almost $27,000. Interestingly, Mackenzie King's investigation revealed that some of the Chinese claims were for businesses related to opium, eventually leading to the creation of Canada's first anti-drug law. In 1909, Harvard University granted Mackenzie King a PhD for his dissertation on Oriental immigration to Canada. In it, he argued against the immigration of Asians, saying that Canada should desire to restrict immigration from the Orient is regarded as natural, that Canada should remain a white man's country is believed to be not only desirable for economic and social reasons, but highly necessary on political and national grounds. Later, when Mackenzie King was Prime Minister during the Second World War, it was he who ordered Japanese Canadians to be interned. In the period following the 1907 riots, Japan and Canada reached a gentleman's agreement to reduce Japanese immigration to 400 males a year. In 1928, that number was further reduced to 150. In 1908, South Asians desiring to enter Canada were targeted through the Continuous Journey Regulation, which was tested in 1914 by the attempted landing of the SS Komagata Maru, which carried passengers from India who had stopped in Yokohama. The Chinese head tax remained at $500, but in 1923, the Exclusionary Chinese Immigration Act came into effect until it was repealed in 1947, mainly as a result of Canada signing the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II. The long history of legislated and social discrimination in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Canada can still be seen in the remaining landmarks of the communities that were the target of the 1907 anti-Asian riots.
Thank you very much for that lovely reading.
Yeah, not as good as Michael's, but he's done a lot more readings than I have.
So I'm curious, before we end today, this is another question that I like to ask. What didn't I ask you today? And perhaps what's the answer to that question?
Oh my God.
I got that trick from a journalist. I'm like, I love that question.
Is there something I want to plug, you mean? Or
I mean, if you want to plug anything, that's cool. Go for it.
Really?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay, well, there's going to be an artist book version for the book. It's a limited edition of 50 copies, and it'll contain all of the 13 360 photographs that have been kind of flattened. They're called,
Nice.
What are they called? Equirectilinear? Oh, I can never remember the word. It's really odd. But you know you ever looked at 360 photographs? They're all kind of distorted and everything. Yeah. So they're large, kind of poster-sized images, and they all go into this box and so forth. So along with the book. So that's something that I've been working on with the designer for this book together, and that'll be released around the same time.
Can you tell actually people when the book will be released and where it will be available?
Yeah, April 4th is the publication date. May 9th, I think, or May 4th in the US. But Arsenal Pulp Press, the publisher, is offering a special 20% off deal right now for pre-sales with free shipping within Canada and US. So for anyone who is listening to the podcast, if it goes out before March 17th, that's the last day, then you could just go to their website and click on any of the pre-sale books. Like there's about 6 or 7 they're releasing. So this is one of them. And they're all 20% off, which is good. The free shipping is actually a huge amount of money. It's actually more than the 20% off. Because as you probably know, shipping in Canada is really expensive.
Prohibitively expensive. Yep.
Yeah.
Terribly so.
Yeah.
But yeah, and is there any way that you might want to tell people if they want to ask you further questions or get into contact with you for whatever reason?
Yeah, I've got a website. So it's just my name, all together, Henry Tsang, henrytsang.ca. And there's a little form in there if they want to email me something. I'll respond unless it's spam.
Well, Henry, thank you very much for your precious time today. And I hope to maybe have you again on the show with a later publication. But it was very informative and very insightful. And I wish you an excellent rest of the day.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your great questions.
Pleasure.